authority someone might have, that the more responsibility that comes upon them, and how they're held to a higher standard. An example of this is parents. In our religion, parents are given a degree of authority over their children. But that is not a privilege, nor is it a reason for them to try to make their lives easier due to being parents. If anything, when we see any issue between parents and children, we turn first to the parents and we say, you can do better. You are parents. You hold that degree of authority. We expect more from you, and what's excusable for a child may not be excusable for you. So our Prophet ﷺ, himself being a religious authority, in many of his sayings and hadith, he emphasized the role and responsibility of religious authority. And so there's a famous narration that we might be familiar with, where he said that scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. There are countless narrations where he highlighted the virtues of the learned and knowledgeable in our communities. In the Quran, Allah Ta'ala speaks about the degree of virtue that people of knowledge have over others. That said, he balanced out the role and responsibility of the learned Muslims in our community with warnings. And so we have in a hadith in the Musnad of Al-Imam Ahmad, where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ أَخْوَفَ مَا أَخَافُ عَلَى أُمَّتِي مُنَافِقٌ عَلِيمُ اللِّسَانِ. He said, what I fear the most for my community, for my nation, is a hypocrite who is really eloquent and seemingly knowledgeable when they speak. The Prophet ﷺ is saying that this is what he fears most for the ummah, because the damage that such an individual can do is great. And that's why we're here to talk about. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned about there will be a group of people that will come, يَقْرَؤُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, and they will recite the Qur'an. But the Qur'an will not go beyond their throats. It will not enter their hearts. It will not transform them. It's the Qur'an. And there is no issue with the Qur'an. The issue lies with the individual. And so because the Prophet ﷺ warned against misguided and corrupt leadership, we find scholars throughout the centuries highlighting the dangers of following corrupt leadership. And so, for example, you'll hear sayings and you'll read sayings of scholars who said, if you see a scholar that's really close to a ruler, you should beware. Because maybe they've sold their deen. They've sold their religion, and they will misguide you in order to serve the rulers. I mention all of this why? I mention, number one, so that we don't think that what we're seeing today is anything new. The Prophet ﷺ from day one informed us that religion can be misused. There's a saying I once read, I think it's really, really apt. It's that religion is good for good people and bad for bad people. Put religion in a good, sincere, pure heart, and it will blossom into a beautiful manifestation of a human being. And put it into somebody who's corrupt at their core or in their heart. And what we will witness is religious teachings being used to now serve evil purposes and motives. Now, the Prophet ﷺ didn't just warn against, potential abuse and misuse of religion. He trained the people around him, those who would be in positions of leadership. He trained them to accept accountability. And he trained his community to be comfortable holding that leadership accountable. And I want to give you some examples. We have in the example of Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu an. And I think it's really interesting that there are multiple narrations about him Because what we know about Umar was that he was a very intimidating person when you read his biography. And so it's mentioned that once a man came to him and said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, O commander of the faithful, فَوَاللَّهِ مَا الْأَمْرُ كَمَا قُلْتَ. You know, you just said something about such and such matter. You're wrong. Look at this. The people around Sayyidina Umar, فَأَقْبَلُوا عَلَى الرَّجُلِ. They got infuriated. And it's interesting because you can start to draw parallels to our community right now. This man criticized Umar. And the people around him became upset and they said, don't criticize the Amirul Mu'mineen. Sayyidina Umar, having been trained at the feet of the Prophet ﷺ, he turns to them and he says, leave the man alone. And look at this statement here. He says, because by Allah, there is no goodness in these people if they don't hold me accountable, and there is no goodness in me if I don't accept their feedback and criticism. Sayyidina Umar was a person, in the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq, it's mentioned, that one day he made a statement. And again, I highlight this to say that when we try to hold religious authority and leadership accountable, this is not something new. This is not a 2024 modern approach to justice. This is rooted in our tradition from the earliest days. And it's hopefully also for us to understand respect. What does respect mean and how has respect potentially been misused? He made a statement. He said, لا تغالوا في مهور النساء. He said, don't get in the habit of paying large amounts of mahr. And he was the leader, the commander of the faithful. And if he says something, people follow. A woman came along, and it's mentioned, she said, لَيْسَ ذَلِكَ لَكَ يَا عُمَرْ. Oh Umar, you don't have the right to say that. You don't have the right to make that statement when Allah has said in the Quran, وَآتَيْتُمْ إِحْدَاهُنَّ قِنْطَارًا. Allah has said that you have given them a huge amount. And in the narration it's mentioned, Umar said, the woman is right and Umar is wrong. In the Sunan of Imam al-Darimi, we have the dua of Sayyidina Umar. He didn't just accept criticism and accountability. In this hadith, or this saying of Umar, he said, رَحِمَ اللَّهُ مَنْ أَهْدَى إِلَيَّ عُيُوبِي. He said, may Allah have mercy on the one who shows me my flaws. He made dua for those who would come along and say, oh Umar, you've made this mistake. What we see is not just an openness to accountability, but an invitation through making dua for the person who comes to present any criticism and feedback. And so what do we understand? We understand that religious leaders are not infallible. We understand that our community needs to be comfortable with accountability. The Prophet ﷺ explained that giving religious leaders far too much authority is questionable from an aqidah and theological perspective. We find this in the Quran in Surah At-Tawbah, where there was a companion by the name of Adi ibn Hatim. He came to accept Islam, and he was still on the fence, not 100% about whether or not he wanted to accept. And when he came to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ said to him and recited a verse to him from Surah At-Tawbah. He said, اتَّخَذُوا أَحْبَارَهُمْ وَرُهْبَانَهُمْ أَرْبَابًا مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ. Speaking of the people of the book, he said, they took their rabbis and their monks as gods besides Allah. Adi ibn Hatim heard this and he said, oh Muhammad, O Prophet of Allah, they never did that. They never worshipped their leaders. He said, no, but their leaders had the power to make what is halal haram and what is haram halal. The leaders deemed themselves above the law. And the Prophet ﷺ is telling Adi ibn Hatim, and by extension telling all of his followers, there is no religious individual above the law. They are subject to the laws that everyone else is subject to. So the idea that when we see something wrong, that maybe it's okay for them, no. When it is unequivocally wrong in our religion, it is unequivocally wrong for everybody, and I would go as far as to say, especially for the religious authorities and religious leaders. Now, I want to clear up a few misconceptions here, because sometimes in our community we come forward and we present these ideas that, number one, how can you expose someone's sins? Number two, we'll come along and say, no, we can't be backbiting about people. Al-Imam al-Nawawi, in his book Riyadh al-Salihin, he mentions 6 instances where it is absolutely permissible to what's considered backbite. The first, he says, is at-tadhallum, when there is oppression taking place. He says, so it is absolutely permissible for the oppressed to go to those who can help them and seek help from them and expose the sin of the oppressor. Absolutely. Number two, he says, it's when there is something wrong taking place and someone sees it. And they want to go and maybe they can't do something about it. So they go to someone else to say, hey, I noticed so-and-so is doing something wrong. In doing that, they have to expose the sin. And Imam al-Nawawi says, absolutely, this is permissible. Why? Because in our religion, the Prophet ﷺ, in Hadith Qudsi, Allah Ta'ala said that He has made oppression haram, forbidden between people. It is forbidden to be performed and forbidden to witness. If we witness it, we call it out immediately. Our religion teaches us that if you see something wrong, you speak up. You try to stop it and you speak up. It is not a matter of this person, it's between them and Allah, and maybe they made tawbah. No. When it involves the rights of others, absolutely, without exception, we step forth and we take action. And it's not the idea that we should go to the victim and say, be patient. This is an absolute misuse of the term patience, because that's not what patience means. To tolerate abuse, never does it mean that. If in fact, true patience means to take action, whatever action a person can take, whether that means asking someone for help, whether that means calling it out publicly, that is what patience means. And so we have to also avoid another one, actually, I forgot. There's a notion sometimes people have that let's not talk about this, otherwise the Islamophobes will have fuel and ammunition. But this is the same mistake that the Catholic Church made. It's not a teaching of our religion, where, in the name of some greater good, you can completely ignore and fail to address the injustice of an individual. That is what the Catholic Church did. And we're seeing what's the consequences of that, the faithlessness that is now spreading. It's because they thought that their institution was more important than any one of the individuals. And that's not our religious teachings. That if there's any one individual who has a complaint, it must be addressed. The Prophet ﷺ, he told us that not only are you responsible for helping the oppressed when you find them suffering, but you have a responsibility to help the oppressor. And the companion said, Ya Rasulullah, what does that mean? And he said, you help them by stopping them from their oppression. Not saying that, no, but what are people going to say about the Muslim community? Not stopping because, Allah knows best. Or maybe they made tawbah. No, you stop them from their oppression if you must warn the wider community so that they are not then in a position again to be oppressed and to be abused, then so be it. That must be done. I want to finish with a few points when it comes to steps of action. Number one, as individuals, I'm really glad that Huma talked about the importance of knowledge, not only with regards to our religion, so that we know when someone says something blatantly wrong, although in vulnerable positions it's hard to be confident, but also to be knowledgeable about spiritual abuse. That's one important point. So we must be careful not to be naive when dealing with any religious authority. Our aqeedah is that there are, besides the prophets, nobody is infallible. Besides the prophets, nobody is ma'asum and infallible. And thus we must be careful not to treat people that way, that we not be overly reverent for religious authorities. We always have to remain critical, and we must try to be alert to warning signs in our own relationships or in the relationships of the people around us, including our children. As a community, we must demand that their systems and policies and processes be in place to defend the vulnerable, such as mandated reporting policies or training, third-party investigation, units in case anything does happen. And finally, just to wrap up, it's essential that we remember one point here. This deen is Allah's deen. This deen is Allah's deen, and Allah will protect His deen, and He will continue to ensure that this deen serves as a means of guidance for people going forward. It is not dependent on individuals. And sometimes you might feel like, is there anybody I can trust for guidance today? Allah commands us in the Quran to seek guidance. He would never leave us without avenues to find that guidance. And so, this religion is above and beyond any individuals, and that must become our approach to the religion, no matter where we go and who we interact with. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us tawfiq to really do better as a community and to constantly strive for improvement and excellence in whatever we do. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.